So, last time we'll meet this semester. So we've covered a tremendous amount of territory this semester. And talking to Deanna while we were waiting, if I understand what she's saying correctly, the two very distinctive topics we've talked about are sameness and stillness. I want to be sensitive, as I mentioned to her and as I've mentioned to the three of you in the past. I don't want this to be a kind of revisionist Heideggerian phenomenology. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge that part of the prism through which I see the world isn't at Heidegger. So, by way of review, one of the points we made very early on in our conversations the key notion that is going to get picked up from Plato is a different definition of philosophy. The typical definition is to translate philosophia as love of wisdom. But if you look more deeply into the origins of the word, and if you look at the use of myth in the world of Plato, in his writings, then it's very clear that what he means is more akin to art, the passion to create. And here we come to the dialogue called The Statesman. You may remember that Plato said he was going to write three dialogues: the sophist, the statesman, and the philosopher.
What's the name for the statesman?
Myth. Sorry. The great mystery for many people is, why did he never write the philosopher? And the answer, I would argue, is because he didn't need to, because the answer is found in the statesman. It is the myth of the unwinding of the universe. In the myth of the unwinding of the universe, the philosopher walks to the crest of a hill and he hears the lost music of the cosmos. The myth of the unwinding of the universe refers back to the original Greek myth of creation, in which the universe is initially created harmoniously. And it is characterized by beautiful music. But when the first two primal gods are murdered by their children, the result is chaos and cacophony. Discordant music. The philosopher is the musician of humans. And through the fashioning of just law, the philosopher creates the fundamental harmony of the ideal city. Mhm. Absolutely. That's correct. The point that we made was that there is a kind of reclaiming of Plato. In Nietzsche. And the phrase that he uses is Villezermacht. We've said that the incorrect translation is the will to power. Nietzsche was a classicist and studied the work of Plato. Great questions. It is very clear to me that what Nietzsche actually meant was the passion to create. And Nietzsche, when he abandons good and evil, he does so in favor of the beautiful and the ugly. Beautiful and ugly are artistic terms. So we're back again to the Platonic concept of harmony and beauty and order, which are intuitively, not rationally, grasped. Are we making sense so far? Okay. So we can think about Nietzsche both as offering the critique, which is kind of a reorientation, but also as laying a kind of foundation. Based around the concept of the passion to create. And finally, there is a kind of refocusing on the human question. Right, exactly. And we see that refocusing on the human in the death of God. It's not about turning to the outside world, as Edward Herbert said. It's not about turning to the inside world, as Descartes said. It's about asking, what does it mean to be human?
So another question. So you're kind of saying that I can do. It's not like literally saying you would want to kill God around his here, or trying to maybe criticize Christians by saying your God is dead, but just offering your reality by saying if you think of God is dead, then it takes maybe that power away from you to have over us to focus more on ourselves.
A little bit of both.
Okay.
His argument is that God becomes a logical construct that plugs up all the holes in the universe.
Oh, like we don't try to figure those things out. We write it off as God.
Right. And additionally, his argument becomes that God is used to keep the weak weak. In other words, we clothe our misery in hope. We abdicate responsibility to God. We accept that we are sinners and therefore turn away from being responsible for the world. And Nietzsche is saying that the only way forward is to kill that God. As we mentioned in philosophy, there is a poem by Nietzsche called To an Unknown God, which is absolutely beautiful and powerful. It's not God in and of itself that Nietzsche's against. It's the God that becomes the logical necessity, the God that makes it okay to be weak and sinful, the God that makes it okay to not be responsible for the world.
This is just a comment. This is really interesting because I feel like as much as I identify with my religion, I'm very open to this way of thinking. And I truly think I believe it's my first core because it gives me a better explanation about some of these things that are written off as people just coming for a religion. When it seems like really, and you kind of said it, he's just asking for us to be responsible in everything.
These are not Nietzsche's words, but they would function as a paraphrase. When God is dead, we are left alone. As I've said in world religions many times, were it not for the belief in life after death and the belief in the God of logic and reason, no sane human would strap a dynamite vest onto their chest, walk into a marketplace, and blow themselves up. The insanity is not a world without God. The insanity is a world with God.
And it sucks because it almost just seems like you're seeking loneliness. This is like the way, well, you know, my point, but I think I'm trying to say this is like the way of pretty much saying what he's really killing is, and you might have already said, it's our idea of God. God, and like you say, like we don't have a true translation of God, not that God, but the God that people think about, which is weird because a lot of times people right now, they always have this thing called like church hurt, and they feel right about it, but really it's not the religion they're going to have, it's the people that are facilitating it. So I think this would be a really good point to build up in this conversation.
Thank you. So, on the foundation of Nietzsche, Heidegger builds the system. And Camus draws out the implications of Plato, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. And we are here. So, the question becomes for us, after Plato, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Camus, what does the world look like? How do we appropriate that experience? How do we draw out further implications? What does the world look like in the 21st century? Are there any questions so far? Okay. I think that one of the most important concepts we have been wrestling with the entire semester, which we find in the conversation about Zorg and Heidegger, which we find in Erich Fromm, is the inherent dualism between being a part of and apart from. Over the course of this semester, we said that this in part drives the dichotomy between I and we. That there is in that moment an intense need for intimacy. When we talked about love, we argued that in the end, the promise of love can never be fulfilled because of the presence of death. That ultimately we are alone together. That there is a taking of the other's death. As my own. I would argue that there is always present in love grief and sadness as much as there is joy and freedom. The shadow of death is always there. And there is a sense in which that grief and that sadness are not just the reflection of the inevitability of death, but the sense in which love remains unfulfilled. The promise of love is that two shall be as one. The line between you and me will be forever erased, but the line is never erased. The line always remains.
Are you saying the will is in between the intimacy, or it's just a write off of the accepting that it's
Our experience of intimacy, that moment when we truly love, we realize that we can only be alone together. I can take your death as my own, but your death always remains yours. So there is always a kind of separateness that stands in the face of love.
okay, so even though you are going together and I accept that, on the other hand, I'm sad because, okay.
That's right. So if you go back to a story that I've often told, I'm working 3 jobs. I'm at Yale. My son is 3 months old. I come home at 2:30 in the morning. I walk into the bedroom. My wife is barely 20 years old. And I see in her head, in her hair, a single strand of gray. And before I can take my breath, I watch her grow old and die. And that moment was so profoundly painful that for the next 13 years, I felt nothing. I was off, shut down. So part of what I'm saying as I think this through is that we said that Dasein, the being that is there, is constantly open to the full range of human emotion. I can't love you without feeling you die. I can't look at the beauty of a flower and not feel the flower's death. So when we think about part of what we were discussing last week, and the week before, we said that stillness and sameness are that moment in which time as we normally experience it stops or ceases to be. And in that moment, in a strange way, almost as though it relates to love and death, I am most myself. And yet I have lost myself. In the same way that when I love in a world in which all that is human dies, in the very act of loving and experiencing the death of the other, I experience my own death. I experience my possibility of no longer being in the world. I am most intimate, and yet I am most alone. That is a lot, so let me stop and let you think or ask some questions. Am I making sense?
Yes. So I'm saying when time stops. So when you have Mr. Hunter back to 50s, so when we realize how we love that person, then we end up feeling insanity. We realize we're alone together. Well, even when we take the rest of our home, that's when in that time of stillness and insanity, time to stop, and then it brings back each other again.
Yes, it's almost as though if we go back to talking about that essay we discussed last week and being at Old Sheldon Church, there was that moment in which I'm sitting on the ground, I'm covered in dirt, I'm mosquito bitten, I'm sweat covered, and I have my phone and I'm watching the words, my words, are suddenly there in the phone, and I send them to Julia. In that moment, it is as though I have stepped out of time. Time is still, in some sense, moving. Everyone around me is still dying. Everything around me is moving towards its ultimate death. And I am somehow there, not there. So intensely in the moment that I don't exist apart from it. And yet, in some strange way, there is that eternal now. And then to my left, I can feel Julia. The normal concept of time at that point is broken, or it has shifted into something deeper. It is as though when we engage time from an emotional perspective, that there is a fundamental alteration of the nature of being in the world. Could I see Julia? No. Could I feel Julia? Yes.
So, just to jump off of that, because I think I just want to clear part of this. It's not that you're literally saying when you do finally feel these emotions, or anybody finally feels these emotions, they are saying in that instance that they accept their death, but you're just pointing out the fact that death is there and it's important in the emotional part because it somewhat pushes us to finally get into that place of real true emotions. And because it's emotional, it's time altering because it doesn't affect anything else. A true emotion, it can only happen out of time because everything else is moving. But when you're really emotional, all you're thinking of is that emotion.
That works.
Okay.
Could you simply say that you can somewhat, I don't know if this really makes sense, but can you somewhat say that when that time stops, that you are kind of immersed in the shadow of death?
Mm-hmm.
Because like when I think about vision, like if a person's saying here, your shadow is here, like even if you move the shadow will follow with you, but when the time stops, you kind of become the shadow.
I like the way you're putting that.
Because then at that time, when you say I lost myself, but you have lost yourself at the same time, like you lost your physical being, but you still appears kind of away from your emotional self.
Yes.
You see that last part again? The part where you said greater. You said something of emotional self.
Oh, like when you are in the shadow of the like lost in yourself, that you are your true self of your emotional self.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
If we take that back to a more traditional Heideggerian way of looking at it, when Heidegger talks about death as my ownmost possibility, it is always implied that it is distant. It is yet to be. And what we may be talking about, if we go back to the distinction between there alongside versus present to hand, it may in fact be that in this moment, death is no longer off in the distance, but death is also there alongside. I am, and I am dying. So, if we want to look at a kind of dark logic, I don't particularly like that phrase. Going back to Camus, we said we would argue that he missed a step. I rebel. Therefore, I am, and I am alone. We've argued over the course of the semester that this experience of being alone is required for me to then say, I rebel, therefore we are, and we are alone. That this affirmation, which he called solidarity, is in fact love. But perhaps we can argue that there is even another step before that. I am dying. Therefore, I rebel. The implication, if you think about our discussions of Heidegger, is that only when I come to terms with thrownness, which is the inevitability of death, only in that moment can I rebel. So in a strange and almost ironic way, I am dying, and yet I am not. I am not yet dead. So if we go back to the concept of angst, as we said a few weeks ago, this is why the angst never goes away. Because in that moment, when I rebel, I am again confronted with the fact that I'm dying. Minute by minute, second by second, I'm dying.
That makes sense. I definitely agree with you that action before you have an action, you have to convince yourself or come to the conclusion that you can do that action. So you can't just choose to do that.
So perhaps, can we say that until I rebel against my own death, I cannot love? Can we say that when you truly love someone, you embrace their time? When I love you as you were, as you are, as you will be, as you will die? Is that not the essence of taking someone's death as your own?
I recently experienced this because yesterday I was talking to my mom on the phone, and she had told me you have to be able to do something because one day I'll have to leave you and help you. And then it made me realize, as much as I love this individual, I am so sad that I can't take him with me forever.
And if we think about the implications, there is a sense in which angst is not just about me. Angst can be other directed as well. My love for you is limited by your death, as well as by my death. All relationships with others are wrapped in uncertainty. When I was teaching high school, I would close all the blinds and I would cover the door, the window and the classroom door, and I would ask my students to sit in silence. And then I would ask them if they could prove that anyone outside the room existed. And the answer, of course, is no. So everything about us, everything about the world is uncertain, tenuous, and ultimately subject to the whim of death. So if we go back to sameness, the negative sense of sameness, as Heidegger talked about it, is clear. It's pretending that we live in a world in which nothing dies. But sameness, in the sense that we were perhaps talking about it last week, is the reality that we live in a world in which Everything dies. It always dies.
So I remember last week we also talked about one of the things from another. So the same is from stillness or stillness from sameness?
Okay? That's a great question, and let's look at that.
Because the sameness, if what you said is true about sameness, is I
Mm-hmm.
thought this one was happening. That's the one I'm playing.
Okay. When Heidegger talks about sameness, it is a negative context. There's a sense in which it is pretending, ignoring death. We clothe the world of despair. So people don't die, they pass. And we wash the world in a kind of antiseptic that keeps us from facing its reality. As Camus said, we all have the plague. And that plague is death. What we proposed last week is that there is a separate sense of sameness. And that sameness is tied to the concept of stillness, to that moment in which time seems to stop. That paradox of being in the world, yet being apart. Almost as though I could step away. So I can watch the words on my phone. I know in some strange way they're mine. But I have no connection to speaking them or typing them. I'm in the bark of the tree, the greenness of the grass, the gray silence of the clouds. So,
That's also where the measurement comes. That's where the measurement comes about as well. It's not that we're measuring ourselves in the earth.
Yep. Exactly. And the ultimate paradox of that moment is that in the stillness, I am most myself, and yet I am least myself.
Would you say most yourself in terms of awareness of your death, and then reach yourself in terms of the present? Well, no, we're still present in the moment, but more so physically present in the moment, like in time.
Yes.
So it's kind of, I guess you could say, it becomes a very clear spectrum on how, let's say, aware and timely aware you are. It's just kind of like going back and forth between and that stillness is going to be more on the side of aware of the death and less on the side of aware of the time.
Yes. And let's take it further. If we go back to Edward Herbert, you'll recall his argument was you can't start with assumptions about the nature of the world, you have to observe the world. So if you think about a conversation we had about Kant, Kant's argument was that all knowledge is ultimately knowledge of appearances. And Kant said the two primordial categories are time and space. And time is the relationship of everything to me. And what I'm arguing is that in that moment of stillness, I am not observing the world. I am not apart from the world. I am in some way an object of myself. That wall between me and the world around me is gone now. I am here. I am not here. I am in the bark. I am not in the bark. So in some profound way that I have yet to explain, in that moment, the sameness and the stillness so ties me to the physical world that the paradox is flipped. I am not apart from, and yet I am. Only now I am not apart from the world, I'm apart from myself. I am an object. I'm there alongside myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in all truth. That's what I'm being in this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in all truth. Sameness seems to be peace that we become the truth versus stillness, I should say. Stillness is truth, which is peace, versus sameness, which is not the full truth, because then you may say to yourself, like you always say, good or not, because you're doing the part where you're one of either both or yourself on the same.
Yes. So in that moment, the stillness is the measure of the fact that I am there wherever there is. I have let go. There are no preconceptions. There is no attempt to understand. There is no need to understand. There is nothing but the emotional engagement and the emotional tie to the world. So if we couch this in terms of one possible way of looking at love, if I really take your death as my own, then I am there alongside myself. Right. And in that moment, when I take your death as my own, then I see you're taking my death, if in fact you truly love me.
So it's not like always be true in those movies where people are like flirting with them, or people say they're flirting with that person, or they're holding hands with it. It's not because it's not like killing yourself. It's just loving yourself.
Well, try it this way. I'm 7 years old. I'm on the farm. A kid falls out of the tree, comes down with his head on the back of the steel prong rake. And as long as I live, I will watch that happen. So that night, when we got back to the barn, a woman said to us first in Spanish and then in English, "What did you learn today?" And the answer was, "You're already old enough to die." And the fact is, we always are old enough to die. We don't know the when, we don't know the how, but it's here now.
It's so hard for me. I feel like as much as this is true, and I don't want to ever be out of the truth, how do you find balance in the possible dark truth, the despair it is, on top of you wanting to be your positive self? But this also, this almost makes it a maturing factor. Like, if you were to tell the kid this as much as you think you true and easy to you, so they hold themselves accountable and then go throughout life without doing things, purposefully that are evil or ill-intended. At the same time, but I want to enjoy life, and I don't want to be that burdened, if I'm going to be honest, with the reality at all times that I need to be so mature and so overbearing and so ready for death to come. Like, how do you personally, or how do you address this if you can do that?
That's a really important question, and I'll try to answer it. And considering what's been going on in my life the last week, it won't be particularly easy. But number one, I believe ultimately that Camus was right. Nietzsche was right. Heidegger was right. I either despair or I choose to love. The whole point of the myth of Sisyphus is that in the end I can't win, but I'm going to do it anyway. And that struggle to love in a world in which all that is human dies is ultimately what defines us. In that moment when I'm sitting on the ground at Old Sheldon Church and I'm covered with dirt and mosquito bites and sweat, my love for the world opens the sameness and the stillness. After all that I have been through, I could be a terrible bastard. And yet, as I said to a student this morning, when she told me that she doesn't understand why I would care, she's my student. She's human. Why would I not care? So there is a kind of defiance. I'm going to do it anyway. I will love in a world in which all that is human dies. And, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was just going to say, I appreciate that about you, and I think that's why I really enjoyed your class, because there's been a lot of times when you reiterated that of, what you just said. And I think that's really important because it's you're letting us know as students, like the real truth or the real rebelliousness in life, really to be badass and all these other things, is to attempt, to try, to love, to be honest, to be truthful. And I feel like that's just not something that's really favored, and it's really hurtful because then you see people do all these other things, and they feel that's badass, and all it does is it just exudes hurtfulness and hatefulness. It's like that doesn't do anything. So I definitely believe in that, and I appreciate this interpretation because I think it helps me personally a lot in my day-to-day logically go through life and do things.
Thank you. Well, let's look at another concept called reciprocity. I can take your death as my own, but whether you take my death as your own, I have no control over that. I read Brave New World when I was 13, and there was a scene at the end of the book that has haunted me. The savage, who is not part of the genetically determined world, falls in love with a woman who was born and bred, literally, in the genetically determined world. And when he quotes her a sonnet from Shakespeare, her response is to quote him the words of a then popular song, "Hug me till you drug me, honey." And at that point,
Wait, can you say that again?
hug me till you drug me, honey. So he's caught between the confrontation of his love and her inability to love him. And that sense of the tragic is an inescapable part of love. If you ask me why Nietzsche died insane, it was the tragedy of love. I can love, but that does not mean I will be loved. So if you can imagine sitting across from the mother of my children who was never intellectually gifted and now she's got dementia. Think about what that means. Or when you take someone's death as your own and you get no response. Or you get hug me till you drug me honey. The ultimate risk when you love is that it heightens your sense of being alone. That which is intended to bind you to others instead binds you to nothing. I remember the first time I heard Paul Simon's song, Dangling Conversation. It's a still life watercolor of a now late afternoon. The sun shines through the curtain lace. Shadows wash the room. We sit and drink our coffee, couched in our indifference like shells upon the shore. You can hear the ocean roar. In the dangling conversation, the superficial sighs, the borders of our lives. And you read your Emily Dickinson and I my Robert Frost, and we note our place with bookmarkers that measure what we've lost. Like a poem poorly written, we are verses out of rhythm, couplets out of rhyme. In syncopated time, lost in the dangling conversation, the superficial sighs, the borders of our lives. Yes, we speak of things that matter and words that must be said. Can analysis be worthwhile? Is the theater really dead? But now the room is softly faded. I only kiss your shadow. I cannot feel your hand. You're a stranger now unto me, lost in the dangling conversation, the superficial sighs, the borders of our lives. When we love in a world in which all that is human dies, it ultimately highlights, accentuates the fundamental aloneness. The more that I love you, the more alone I become. And so, in the stillness, I remember.
So in the reading, you start to question what is self-love? Because how do you choose to get there? Because I think I started to feel like I love people more, I feel like I care. And then people constantly tell me you need to turn that back to yourself. Okay, I can do things for myself, I can take care of myself, I can exercise. But that's me maintaining and trying to be the best of myself. But that doesn't mean I love myself. And so how do I achieve that? And how do I get there? Especially true love is all it is, which I believe it is. At least that's what I think about what love is, but that's what I would assume. So how do you have it for yourself?
Well, in all honesty, I'm not sure you can.
Right. Right.
And I think, honestly, that the fallacy of the modern world is that if you love yourself, everything is better. The reality of the modern world is that we all love ourselves, and so we live empty, hollow lives. As T.S. Eliot said, we are the hollow men.
So those are claims you already are.
Yeah. By definition, I can confront my death. I can take my death as my own. But that has nothing to do with loving myself. It has everything to do with loving you. I can passionately create myself, but I have to love you. Other questions or thoughts so far? Deanna, what's going on?
It was just, it's literally part about self-love, not really resistance and honest, because I feel like that's something what they used to have. I'm struggling with kind of love people very easily, but for myself, that's really hard. And I do think, especially after philosophy, I've taken on every maybe taken other people's as well, but I still struggle to just find that place in myself where I guess I don't even know if comfortable is the word, but just at a place where I can say that, oh yes, I love myself just as much as I love others to take their death as mine. It's very interesting to think about all these different levels, but then also know that I can't really genuinely, truly love myself because it really doesn't. It's a construct that society doesn't.
I agree. We can care for ourselves. We can nurture ourselves. But go back to our lecture on narcissism and selfishness. The reality of our world is we're so busy loving ourselves, we can't and won't love anyone else. We all have our own truth. We have all decided what's good for us. And the hell with everybody else.
So another of this private process things. I think her point right now is well, then maybe when people could be confusing with something else, especially with this popularization of self-improvement.
Yes.
Is maybe purposefulness or self-achievement. Because to me, it seems like a lot of times these people that seem to be the keepers of the knowledge of self-love and being all of that they are, they're always, at least to me, especially these people that are self-achieving and what they consider is their purpose. So I would challenge them, or maybe even see if if you can offer ways for us to find out more about the confusion of you not really feeling love until you achieve, because then at that point, maybe you don't have a mate to accept a death point, but you have a goal to accept it.
You're right. We don't hear this word as much as it was bantered about in the 1960s, and the word is alienation. We live in a world that has been stripped of love, stripped of connection, stripped of family, stripped of tribe. We literally spend our lives wandering, and the irony is that we can't find ourselves apart from the world. Remember, one of the fundamental concepts that we've talked about throughout this series of lectures is that we keep coming back to the whole question of being both a part of and apart from the world around us. That doesn't ever go away. And when we strip away our connection to the world, we have no mechanism within which to figure out who we are. It's inescapable. I would argue that the despair that we witness in our world, the depression, the eating disorders, the rampant crime, are all marks of the fact that we're alienated, we are cut off. We are so aware of ourselves as individuals that we are now incapable of connecting to the world in any meaningful human way. One of the points we've made since the beginning is that this started in the 17th century. 400 years, 300 years, 800 years, if we don't make a change, the radical cult of the individual will only get worse. And so will the despair, the denial, the lies. but we exist apart of and apart from. And if we are to be truly human, then the only option is to exist within the paradox. It is not either or, it is both. That risk that is embodied when we love in a world in which all that is human dies is an inescapable reminder that I am you and I am not you. And however much I long to be completely connected to the world, except in that moment of stillness, I am not. And the paradox of stillness is that I lose myself in order to find myself. I am so completely in the paradox that time stops. And so you see, I have come to doubt all that I once held as true. I stand alone without belief. The only truth I know is you. And as I watch the drops of rain weave their weary paths and die, I know that I am like the rain, and there but for the grace of you go I.
What's the name of Nietzsche's aloneness?
To an unknown God, if you email me, I will send you a translation since it's in German. Any last questions, thoughts?